Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome back to the Embody Lab Masterclass today with Dr. Dan Siegel. All right. So with no more further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Daniel Siegel. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine and the founding director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He's also the executive director of the Mindful Institute, which focuses on the development of mindset, teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel has published extensively for both the professional and lay audiences. His 5 New York Times bestsellers are Aware, The Science and Practice of Presence, Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Human Being, Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, and 2 books with Tina Payne Bryson, PhD, The Whole Brain Child, and No Drama Discipline. Other books include The Developing Mind, The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, Mindsight, The Mindful Brain, and The Mindful Therapist. And he's also written The Yes Brain and The Power of Showing Up with Tina Payne Bryson, PhD. And his latest book, just going to get it so that I make sure that I say it correctly, is Interconnected, the me-we as integration of self-identity and belonging. We'll look forward to hearing a little more about that. Dr. Siegel also serves as the founding editor of the Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology, which currently contains over 70 textbooks. Pretty exciting. And now over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And before we turn off the chat, let me make sure everyone can hear me okay. So let's just see from the group. Let's hear some thumbs up or yeses on the chat, and then we can close that down so we can focus. Great, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. That's beautiful. Well, we have the time today to go through a scientific view of a very useful practice that helps us understand the role of consciousness in change. And to do that, I'm going to sort of walk you through a set of slides, and I'm happy to make these slides available to you. And the idea is just to let this wash over you. In today's gathering, we won't do a practice, but we'll talk about some of the findings of this presencing practice called the Wheel of Awareness. And in doing that, we can draw on literally tens of thousands of people who've done the practice in person with me and then shared their experiences, and then trying to come together in a way to take different branches of science, different indigenous teachings, different contemplative teachings, and see if there's what E.O. Wilson would call consilience, or a common ground across those. So to do that, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we'll be able to just go through this. And the idea is not for you to take these slides and memorize them or worry that you're going to get every detail of them, but just to get the feeling of what it means to be aware. And thank you so much for your responding in the chat box, but we can turn that off now. So again, I'll go through these slides, but it's not that you need to memorize them all. It's just to get a feeling for where we're going to go when we open up for our discussion. So the first thing to say is the area I come from is the land that was traditionally taken care of by both the Tongva in Los Angeles, what's called Los Angeles now, and the Chumash in more Santa Monica, Malibu, the beach areas. And the teachings of both the Chumash and the Tongva were always about our connection to nature and the deeply embedded identity we have as human beings to be stewards of nature. And because of the nature of our human minds, I also want to say that if anything I say or do from the position of privilege I have here in North America, especially in the United States, where as a person who is white and heterosexual, cisgender individual with a lot of education, I'm definitely going to have blind spots for my blind spots. So if anything comes up, please reach out to us at info@mindsightinstitute.com and just let us know so we can keep the channels of learning and communication open. So awareness is something across cultures, and indigenous teachings have taught for a long time that the way we open up to a broad identity is the important way of living a life. Yet in modern culture, we've kind of constricted that awareness to an identity that is thought of as a solo self. And we'll come to that as we go through the relationship between awareness and identity soon. So the questions we're going to ask to begin with are, what is the mind itself that experiences awareness? And if we're implying that, we've come to a place in modern times when the human mind has created a constricted experience of identity, and it's not very healthy for the individual, for relationships with other people, or even for a healthy world, as we're sadly seeing, what is actually a healthy mind made of? And then what can we do to be supporting the cultivation of a healthy mind and even a healthy world? So the kinds of things we're going to talk about today, and certainly in the book Intra-Connected, I try to address this, is that whether you're working as a parent raising children, a teacher in schools, a coach supporting people's development, a psychotherapist, just a citizen on the planet, whatever we're doing, there's a way we can actually make a difference in this world of ours. And that's what I hope this presentation will allow us to look at. So the mind has been a fascination for human beings for as long as we have written documentation. And we can, from a scientific point of view, say that it includes at least 4 facets. One is just the sense of being alive, the felt sense, sometimes called first-person experience or subjective experience. And then you have the way of knowing you're having that in something called awareness or consciousness. And then you can talk about it by using words called information processing. And those 3 are commonly talked about in the field of psychology. But we're going to propose actually a 4th facet of mind, which takes us beyond the first 3, which are important, but don't really guide us to addressing the question of what is a healthy mind. And let's see how that all unfolds. This is a long line of reasoning in a textbook I wrote years ago called The Developing Mind, that is now in its 3rd edition, where the proposal is that the mind can be defined. And you may be aware that the mind is not defined in almost every field that deals with the mind, like psychiatry, where I was raised, psychology, where I'm trained to be a researcher, even the whole field of mental health, believe it or not, doesn't have a definition of what the mind is, short of calling it brain activity. But what we're going to say is actually there's a much larger story than just limiting the mind to the head. And we're going to talk about it as an embodied and relational, self-organizing emergent process that regulates the flow of energy and information. And what this definition did 30 years ago was allow a bunch of scientists, I had gathered together 40 of them, to actually take their disparate ways of approaching reality and actually come together. So it does a couple of things that I think are important just to mention here. It says that from the mathematics of complex systems, there's something called emergence. And we know that if a system has certain qualities called, chaos capable, open, and nonlinear, don't worry about that. But if you're a complex system, it means you have emergence. And what we're saying is the mind is something to do with this complex system, kind of like the wetness of water emerges from the complex system of water molecules. Any given water molecule doesn't have wetness, but together their interaction creates it. That's an emergent property. And one of the emergent properties that the mathematics of complex systems tells us is that it regulates its own becoming. And this is not intuitive in any way. but it is mathematically demonstrated in our universe. So what that means is that a process called self-organization, a math term, governs how energy flows, if you talk about energy being the stuff of the system. Excuse me. So what that tells us then is that energy, which is sometimes flowing in a pure form, sometimes constructed as information, meaning a symbolic form of energy, can be guided by attention. And that is the absolute superpower we have, that what you can learn to do is harness attention in very specific ways. Some of them involve what's called consciousness, and we can use what that process of focal attention. Some of attention actually doesn't involve consciousness, so we call it non-focal. And at times, attention is pulled to us, like, a loud noise outside. Other times we guide it. So the kind of attention we're going to talk about today is guided focal attention. We're going to talk about putting attention into awareness and intentionally guiding it in ways. So there's lots of other ways energy flows, but this is one of them. And we're going to talk about, in doing that, structuring a capacity to actually sense the mind with something I call mind sight, a kind of lens with the metaphor of a tripod. When you learn, and you can teach this to yourself, you can teach it to your children, you can teach it to your clients, patients, we have the ability to be open to what is rather than constricting our awareness of what is happening. We have a way of sensing that what's going on is an object of our attention, like a feeling of sadness. So instead of ignoring the sadness and not being open to it, we can be open to it. We can sense sadness is a part of our experience, an object of attention. It's not the totality of our identity. And that there's an observer who's actually in the midst of being open and objective about the sadness. Those three O's, openness, objectivity, and observation, essentially stabilize this metaphoric mind sight lens so that what you see has more clarity, depth, detail. It has more focus. And then you can do something about it. So to strengthen the mind requires that we stabilize this mind sight lens. When people have think about it, having a camera, when you have a camera that isn't stabilized, what you get is a very jumbled picture, and there's not much you can extract from that. So the first step of learning to regulate energy flow is to learn to stabilize the lens that allows you to see it. Now, once you start looking across all these different disciplines, whether it's indigenous teachings, contemplative teachings, different disciplines of science, math, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, linguistics, sociology, anthropology, which is what we do in this field called interpersonal neurobiology, certain foundational ideas start to emerge that were found independently in these different pursuits. And so we call that consilience. So one is our proposal that the human mind is an emergent phenomena of a complex system of energy flow. And that system is not restricted to your head. And it's not even restricted by your skin encased body. That mind is both fully embodied, not just in skull, but because the skull and skin are not barriers for energy to flow, then we basically live in both an embodied and relational field of energy. And that field is a part of what we're saying is the complex system from which the mind emerges. Now, you'll see a lot of people disagree with that, but they don't come up with another definition. So at this point, 30 years later, that definition has served very well to actually predict what future research would find, as you'll see in a moment. And as we've said, sometimes this energy flow is just pure, and sometimes it's in a formation that is symbolic of something, and we call it information. And we've said emergence is the way something arises from the interaction of elements of a complex system. And we're saying those elements are the embodied activity of energy throughout the skin and case body, and also our relationships, like what's happening right now among us. Now, if you take two other ideas and combine them, the first idea is, as you'll see, integration, which we'll define in a moment, is the basis of health, and consciousness is needed for change. And that's, again, looking across lots of different disciplines and trying to extract a common finding. Even if they don't say it itself, you can look at it and understand how people study reality, how they measure reality, how they conceive of reality. And then once you understand that discipline's point of view, you can actually see some fascinating commonalities that on the surface you wouldn't necessarily see. So it's just that's the process of consilience. And what we're going to talk about is when you combine these two, you get this thing called the integration of consciousness. And that's what today's talk is all about. Now, integration is very clearly defined in this way as the linkage of differentiated parts. So that view is a different use of the word integration in other fields, but it's the way we're going to define it. And optimal self-organization emerges with integration. Now, to visualize that, it's kind of like a river where there's a central flow of integration in the river itself. And interestingly, from the mathematics of complex systems, when you leave that integrated flow, you either go to one bank of chaos, the other bank of rigidity. And this diagram basically explains the entire Bible of mental disorders. They can be reconsidered as either symptoms of chaos or rigidity or both. And though the psychiatric field doesn't describe health, we can describe health as the integrated flow. And what does that look like? It has these 5 qualities that spell the word FACES. It's flexible, adaptive, coherent means it holds well over time or resilient. Energized means it has a sense of vitality. And stable means it's reliable, not that it's rigid. So we're going to use the phrase FACES flow to just summarize this integration. And what we're going to propose is that this set of 5 characteristics is a way of defining mental health. It's actually a way of defining health, period. Even if you look at, biological systems, this is pretty much what a healthy system is. We're going to look at this notion that you can then integrate consciousness by putting the knowing of consciousness, one aspect of a consciousness or being aware, in the hub of a metaphoric wheel. It's actually a table in our office. And then on the rim, we're going to put all the knowns that we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is what we mean by finding a practice where you integrate consciousness. And this is a practice now where we've collected the data from many people doing it. And it gives us a sense that you can conceive of basically what human experience is made of is of energy and information flow. It can be in your body. That's super important. And this we can call the embodied brain, because it's a nervous system that's extended way beyond the skull. And this energy flow can become information. But the same thing happens if I go blah, 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 and just make noise and you hear the noise. That would be the relationship we have with each other, but that'd be pure energy. Or if I say good morning, that would be information. And then in the mind of that is this emergent property that's coming from both relational and embodied flow of energy. So we want to be very aware that the mind serves as a conduit, meaning energy flows through our subjective experience, and a constructor, meaning in this case, these drawings from my daughter, Madeline Siegel. And the idea would be, this soapy water would be the energy. Our mind would be the wand. Sometimes just goes through us and we have these bubbles, and that would be a conduit function. Sometimes it goes through us and we construct out of energy symbols like 2 + 3. And when you look at studies of how the mind can be actually trained, the research suggests that when you do 3 things, you get all sorts of very powerful positive effects. So these are 3 pillars, is what you can call 3-pillar mind training. And they include the focus of attention, the strengthening of that capacity, the opening of awareness, and the building of kind intention. And these are 3 ways of describing what some researchers would say is mindfulness training. Others would say it's mindfulness plus compassion training. So there was an agreement in a recent research meeting I went to. So I made up this term 3-pillar mind training, and there was consensus among all the researchers that was a good term to use instead of mindfulness training. So it makes it clear what we mean by getting mindfulness under your belt as a student of mindful practice, is that you're learning to focus your attention, open your awareness, and build kind intention. And when you do these 3 things on a regular basis, the research is quite robust that it leads to a reduction in stress hormone cortisol. It enhances your immune function. It improves cardiovascular risk factors. It reduces inflammation by changing the regulatory system called the epigenetic regulators on top of your genes that control inflammation. And it even optimizes an enzyme called telomerase by repairing and maintaining the ends of the chromosomes. So it slows the aging process by that process and all the other ones too. In addition to these 5 molecular mechanisms of physiological health, it also leads to changes in the structure and function of the brain that can be summarized simply with the word integration. And it turns out that all the studies of well-being show the number 1 predictor of well-being across many measures of well-being is how integrated your brain is. And the opposite is true when you look at every mental disorder and the brains of individuals that are there in the studies. There's impaired integration in the structure and function of the brain. So it's remarkable consilience. Integration is there in health. Integration is impaired in unhealth. It's quite remarkable. What do we mean by growing integration in the brain? There are 4 ways you can study it in function and structure. The corpus callosum connects the 2 sides of the brain to each other that are differentiated. The hippocampus connects differentiated memory systems that are anatomically distributed to each other. The prefrontal cortex basically takes cortical functioning at the top, links it with subcortical areas, the body itself, and even the relational world. And there's a process of research called the connectome, which are the more subtly differentiated areas and how they're linked. And it's the interconnectedness of the connectome that's the best predictor of well-being. And you can get into the brain. We're not going to do that today, but you can actually look at both structure and function of this organ up in the head and show that integration of this structure is associated with resilience and well-being. And if you're missing in certain ways integration, which is what trauma does, for example, it leads to a dysfunction of what's called regulation. And you can look at certain areas that are involved in the construction of a self and see whether they're integrated or not. And an excessively differentiated default mode network, mostly midline, is associated with anxiety and depression, for example, and an excessive sense of isolated self, which is unfortunately present in modern culture. So this slide just reminds us that if culture is telling you that you're separate and your brain then starts to believe what culture is telling it, it will generate a lot of excessively differentiated default mode activity. And that is directly associated with anxiety and depression. So this is where you see, even if you see a brain study, it doesn't say, oh, there's something wrong with the brain. There could be something wrong with culture. that is getting the brain to learn this way of being. So one needs to really be very circumspect about saying, oh, look, there's something wrong with the brain. The brain responds to the environment in which it's growing. So to summarize, well-being correlates with an interconnected connectome. Impaired well-being correlates with impaired integration in both relationships and the brain, amazingly. And that supports our notion of the mind being both relational and embodied. Neural integration is the mechanism, it turns out, beneath regulation of mood, emotion, thought, attention, behavior, relationships, and morality. It's quite unbelievable, but that's just true. So what we know from attachment research is that integrated relationships that honor differences and promote linkages lead to neural integration in the whole body. So we'll call it embodied integration. And that together help create optimal regulation, which allows for personal and relational health. So that's kind of a background on, the idea of being present, let's say as a parent, is that you are facilitating integrated relationships, which are the gateway for a child to develop an integrated brain. The same thing can be said about a teacher in a classroom, and the same thing can be said about a therapist in the process of psychotherapy. So number 4, integrated relationships is where we have this capacity to bring presence into our connection with other people. So we're going to dive now deeply into the idea of integrating consciousness with this metaphoric wheel of awareness. And the simple thing to say about integration is that you differentiate and then you link. That's what integration is. So to integrate consciousness, consciousness has at least 2 differentiatable features. One is the knowing, the other is the known. So you distinguish awareness from the thing you're aware of. And then what you do is you systematically move this spoke of attention, which is focused attention, using focal attention, guiding it as the metaphor of a spoke. The rim of the wheel would be the knowns and the hub is the knowing. And then you come back to that wheel we talked about. So now you can see the whole background to it. These metaphoric places on this wheel basically represent forms of energy. So a body sensation, for example, would be energy coming from inside the body, or the first 5 senses, energy coming from outside the body. Mental activities, probably energy in the head, like thoughts and emotions, reasoning, beliefs, narratives, all that stuff. We'll just call that mental activity. And our sense of connectedness from the body outward is interconnection. A feeling of the whole would be intra-connection. And that's also energy flow in a relational field. So basically, this is an energy wheel, if you will, that is integrating it. So we could equally call this, I guess, a wheel of integration. And we're going to focus especially today on some amazing findings. The wheel has been given to 50,000 people. I'm not exaggerating the number, in person. And for those who take the microphone, they share what's going on. I'll give you some quotes from what they've said in a moment. But especially this part of the wheel practice, you're moving the spoke around the different segments. This one, you're bending the spoke around into the hub itself. Sometimes people like to retract it or just leave it in the hub or just have no spoke at all. But the general sense is they're being in pure awareness. So initially, this was with 10,000 people. Now it's with 50,000 people. When I did it in the first 10,000, I systematically offered it exactly the same way. Then for fun, with the remaining 40,000, I just did it in different ways and I got the exact same results. So it didn't matter if they heard no science first, science first. It didn't matter. Amazingly, people would feel a shift in their relationship with others and the self. They would experience, as they went through, let's say, a week-long workshop, a reduction in chaos and rigidity. So it was like they were moving more towards an integrated flow of that river. And then in the part when they bend the spoke around, I want you to think about, what does it mean that over and over and over again, people would use these words like clarity, joy, And this phrase, empty yet full, expansive, infinite, eternity, God, love, peace, sense of belonging as a fundamental part of the whole, connected to others, the world, the universe. Why would just having a metaphor of a wheel and then doing a practice where you systematically move it around, and we have this up on our website and people send us emails with exactly the same thing, not just my students in workshops, but just the general public that uses our website. Why would people be saying this? This is a question I want to ask you. And, you know, what we can do is actually, let's open up the chat. And if anyone has an idea at this moment in our gathering here, what comes to you? You're not doing the wheel now, but we're just sort of talking about the ideas behind it. Let's see if there's anything that comes up that gives you a feeling of that. And let me see if I can find, I don't see my chat function. Let me see if I can get to it. Yeah, so let's see what you think it might be. Let's see. So we'll open it up. So the chat is now open. Great. And integration connotes wholeness versus separation. Seems like the descriptors, sense of belonging, peace, love, are consistent with those. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's some wholeness. I agree, Tina. There's some wholeness that seems to be emerging from that hub. Remember, we're really focusing now on the part when you look in the hub. And it's so interesting using that word. The next book I'm writing, the name of the book is Wholeness, trying to get a feeling of what that is. And even in Interconnected, it's about the wholeness of thing and not separation. So let's see if anyone else has something they want to add. Let's just wait a moment. And if not, it's hard, but I'm going to take you on a journey in a moment to look into that. Okay, so let's go ahead. For the sake of time, let me see where that is. I don't think that's it. Let's see where it went. There we go. Okay. No, that's not it. Let me see. Let me get back to where we're there. You can see that? Beautiful. So let's see if we can figure this out in some way. So, you know, when you do, I'm a scientist as well as a clinician, you know, and in just hearing this over and over and over again, what happened to me was I was able to, be with a bunch of physics experts, physicists, and to me, they're one of the best sources of expertise from a scientific point of view in energy. And this is when what they said when I kept on drilling down with them. I said, well, what actually is energy? And they said, energy is the movement from possibility to actuality. And that definition from quantum physics blew my mind. And I started drawing it out for them. And I said, okay, so would it be like this? Like if there were all the possible words, let's say we had with just 1 million words, let's use that as an example. Right now in this graph, we could say that change would be along the horizontal line, the x-axis, and probability is along this vertical y-axis. And at this moment, at the bottom of that y-axis, we're at point A. Your chance of knowing what I'm going to say is 1 in 1 million. Physicists call that near 0% probability. It's very unlikely you're going to guess the word I say. But once I say ocean, a possibility became an actuality. I said ocean, and so now we're at point A1. Well, that's really interesting. So what they said was, yes, that's what they mean by the movement from possibility to actuality. And if we even say, let's say point C, let's say there are 5 things I'm thinking about, your chance of guessing is 1 out of 5 or 20%. So it's higher up. But now I say, you know, Pacific Ocean of the 5 oceans that could have been said, and you move to C1. So if you take this notion that energy is the movement along a probability distribution curve, which is the y-axis, as it changes, that's what flow means, change, then energy flow is basically the change in its position along a probability distribution curve. So we would talk about where you're at in terms of a given moment along an energy position location on this graph. And then if you actually make a z-axis in and out of the plane of this diagram and say that's all the different things that could happen at any given moment, let's just call that diversity, then the bottom place where everything is sitting would be considered the plane. It's the shape of a plane. So it's the plane of possibility. So now with this diagram, I took this to the physicists and I said, is this what you mean? And they go, yeah, that's exactly what we mean. Only we don't call that the plane of possibility. I said, okay, what do you call it? They said, we would call that the quantum vacuum. And the quantum vacuum is a mathematical space in quantum physics, which is, according to Arthur Zions, who was at this meeting I was at, quantum physics emeritus professor at Amherst, he would call that the sea of potential, or in Arthur's terms, the formless source of all form. It's where possibility hangs out before it turns into actuality through a series of probabilities. So you can basically make a diagram with, words we can share with each other, where actualization would be the peak when you've reached that top of the y-axis, the probability of 100%. But remember when we just had 5 things we can name, like 5 oceans, that would be a plateau, would be a subset. In this case, in this diagram, you see 3 things in there that could turn into actualities. So that would be a plateau, but then we have the plane. So this just helps us have a vocabulary view on your probability distribution curve. Are you at a peak, which is an actualization? Are you at a plateau, which is a subset of things that could arise? Or are you in that generator of diversity, that, formless source of all form, the sea of potential, what we're calling the plane of possibility, because it's in the diagram. So this is, about peaks, plateaus, and the plane. And it helps us communicate with each other about what's going on. And so here, after doing this with all these people, the wheel of awareness, this is what I think is going on with our human mind. That a thought, emotion, memory would be examples of peaks. The experience of thinking, emoting, and remembering would be sub-peak positions along that probability distribution curve. And a state of mind or intention or mood would be a plateau. And you can see on this diagram, the hypothesis is, and this could be completely wrong, it could be partially right, or it could be completely right. The proposal here is that the experience of knowing, of consciousness, that is, of being aware, comes when the energy is in the plane of possibility position. Now, the physics view is not about consciousness, it's about energy. So we're bringing these conciliant ideas together. We're saying, well, if the mind is really an emergent property of energy, and if physics is right, that energy is this movement from possibility to actuality, then let's put those together and say, here's a diagram of the mind. So if you read the Developing Mind 3rd edition, you'll see I put this in all over the book, because there's been enough over and over and over again to support this view. So let's see what this looks like. What this means is that mental experience then arises from an energy probability distribution curve. That's what we're saying. Mental representations and activities are peaks. Mental processes of mood, intention, mode, and modes of thinking, for example, are plateaus that you can get stuck in. They can be very efficient. They make energy into information very efficient, but if they get rigid, they can limit you. But they're very useful. When you get in a car, you should use your car driving plateau to know what to do in that car. But when you're trying to have an open mind, you need to access that plane of possibility. And we're saying that awareness arises from this open plane where certainty is near zero and possibility is infinite. Now, that view helps all sorts of things. We won't go through this long list, but just to say that people talk about love, interconnection, and awareness emerging in that hub. And, you know, I'm an acronym nut, so there's an acronym COAL. You can remember this with its connection, open awareness, and love. This is what's in that hub over and over and over and over and over again. It's remarkable. And when you start understanding the wheel of awareness like this, it changes how you actually live. It's quite remarkable. And what I'm going to say to you now is way out there, but I figure it looks like it's true, so I may as well take a guess at it. The idea is that the plane represents maximal uncertainty, but the synonym for that is freedom and possibility. And when you look at the science of energy and you look at what physics has demonstrated, you come to realize that there is a realm called the quantum realm by physics folks, where there is no what is called arrow of time, which only exists in what's called the macro state realm. It's a directionality of change. So in that sense, the quantum realm is timeless. There's no time variable. And look at what people say in that hub. It's timeless. I do the wheel of awareness every day. For the most part, every day, like this morning, you know, I get into that hub when I'm bending this book around and I enter this timeless state. For those people who are experienced with psychedelics, they say this is exactly like a psychedelic. And when my colleague Dacher Keltner actually, you know, did the mystical experiences scale, he got the same scores you'd get as if people were on psychedelics when they did the wheel. They're probably tapping into the same mechanism. Now, in this quantum realm, there are verb-like events that are deeply intra-connected versus noun-like entities that are existent in what's called the classical realm or the macro state Newtonian realm. So what I'm going to invite you to do in your own experience is try out the wheel and see what it's like for yourself. Don't believe what I'm saying or even what tens of thousands of people have said. Doesn't matter. You see what works for you. And in this practice, then what we're saying is that the wheel of awareness is a way for you to experience this movement along this probability distribution curve where the rim are the plateaus and peaks and the hub is the plane. That's the hypothesis. And then you can learn all about the peaks arising from the plane or peaks arising from plateaus. You start to become very aware of where your energy flow is arising. And when you look at what we can call an attentional sweep, you come to realize that you can have focal attention, that is paying attention to something like a flower, let's say, that you're just barely paying any attention to it, or you imbue that with a tremendous amount of presence. And that's because there's this 40 cycle per second sweep. And that sweeping process allows you to have both the thing you're aware of, the flower, and the experience of awareness. And depending on, you know, I call it a ratio, the ratio of plane to above plane values, you can have very different qualities of being aware of that flower. But what that means then is that the spoke is a metaphor for the mechanism of the attentional sweep. And you can learn to live very much with presence by having this sweeping process include more of the plane. And that's a skill that the wheel of awareness allows you to do. So there are quotes we don't have to get into. What I want to end with and then open up for discussion is, you know, the science then of presence is essentially when a human being maybe just innately in their life or learned by training, learns to imbue experience with a tremendous amount of access to the plane of possibility, then there's a quality of being open to what arises, knowing that these, peaks that arise are just objects of attention, and then even coming to realize that the observing capacity that narrates our experience is itself even a rim element. And this becomes really fascinating, where the plane of possibility is not the observer. It's not the narrator. Narration is a construction that's on the rim in that third segment, but rather you start experiencing just pure awareness, where it's not your awareness, it's just you're dropping into this spaciousness in which there is no observer. There's just the experience of knowing. So that can be understood in a way by this diagram, which shows a very low-lying plateau. And let's just name that low-lying plateau, this sense of a separate self. So you can have certain things from that separate self plateau, like I know how to play tennis, or I'm going to, get a degree in becoming a therapist or something. And then you have all these peaks that arise from that. And then ultimately it's all sitting on top of this low-lying plateau. But what can happen in someone trying out the wheel of awareness, for example, is they go beyond what they may have experienced in other practices, where they're coming from that low-lying plateau and it's all fine and they're learning to regulate their emotions and stuff like that. Here now, they start to dissolve away an experience of a separate self. And for some people, it leads to a sense of panic and a dissolution of, in quote, everything I once knew I was. Or as one of the workshop participants said, the wheel of awareness took me to pieces. And then there was this pause. And then she goes, but now I'm at peace. So it's a way of visualizing what her experience and many other people's experience is when this low-lying plateau, if it's about the separate self that gives some illusion of certainty, then a practice like the wheel of awareness, where you distinguish the hub from the rim and you go right into that hub, it can freak people out. So we have to be very mindful that people can develop a panic reaction to bending the spoke around. Now, that doesn't mean that the bending the spoke into the hub is full of panic. It's probably that there's a plateau that is telling them letting go of control and letting go of certainty is dangerous. And so far, in doing this with my own patients or doing this in workshops, that's always been the case, that when we uncover where the panic was arising and they can work through that, whether it's in therapy or the support in a workshop, they get to a place of incredible peacefulness when they realize they don't have to be controlling everything all the time. Or as the artist Rashid said in the Brooklyn Public Library entryway, having abandoned the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. So the wheel of awareness gives people a shift from controlling life and trying to be in the driver's seat to actually coming to trust the universe as ultimately being composed of love. That connection, open awareness, and love. And so people start to live in a very different way, very different way. And they start to shift their self-identity and belonging so that they come to experience that in a very different way. You can extend this metaphor to the acronym sibling, which has self-identity, belonging, and then love and intra-connection, not inter, but intra, where there's a wholeness from which you live. And noesis is the conceptual knowing, and gnosis with a G is experiential knowing. So when people do the wheel, they start to feel that they are siblings in the family of life. And this is a shift, that in many ways, I think our human family is waiting to happen. It's what I talk about in the book, Intraconnected. So when you look at self and wholeness, you come to, when you look at all the different sciences that study self anyway, there's another acronym, SPA, which is sensation or subjectivity. That's the S of SPA. Perspective or point of view, that's the P. And agency, how you create action in the world, that's the A. So in modern culture, we're often told, who you are is just your body. Not indigenous cultures, not in contemplative traditions, but in modern culture, perhaps derived in Europe, in the West, but now all around the world. And this way a sense of self is constructed by our families, by our schools, by our societies, can create a sense of separation, defining the self as only coming from the individual body. And the wheel of awareness in terms of presence opens people up to a very different sensation of what that identity is. Almost like there's an identity lens that can be widened to include not just the body, but to include one's connection to all of humanity, and in fact, to all of living beings. And then the perspective, you start to realize, I don't just see things through my own eyes, hear things through my own ears. I can feel into the perspective of, other people in the family I'm in, or other people in my neighborhood, or all of humanity, or the perspective of all living beings. And when we take on that perspective and we feel that subjectivity of a larger sense of self than just the individual body, then we can take action in the world and have agency to work on behalf of the greater good. So this becomes not just about, the individual is now feeling whole and that's cool. It's actually the future of life on Earth may depend on realizing we have this identity lens and we can learn to adjust it. So one way of talking about that is with this word intra-connected, that we have this beautiful word interconnected, where there are two separate entities, A and B, and they're connected to each other. And that's beautiful. That's fantastic. And acknowledging the reality of interconnection is so important. This takes us one step beyond that. And it says there is a connectivity within the whole where, rather than seeing things as separate entities that are connected to each other, there's a wholeness where things are more verb-like, deeply interconnected processes, and the wholeness of it is not interconnected, but intra-connected. So we can remember that with the me word being an inner spa of sensation, perspective, and agency, but the relational, the inter spa of sensation, perspective, and agency, we can call a we. And when you combine those together, you get mui, an interconnected integration that is honoring differences and promoting linkages of both the inner and the inter, so that the differentiated aspects are linked in an integrative flow and they don't lose their integrity in the integration. And that's what interconnected is. So my hope in us being together today is that this possibility of finding an inter relationality, that's the we, and the inner sense of me that can be cultivated as well, can be combined into the we. And I'll just say that in our gathering together, we can look at why we need people to have presence, why consciousness is needed for change, not just in psychotherapy, but in our broader culture. And when we do that, we come across some wild notions. And that is that we actually have, as this is the cover of the Scientific American in July 2018, very good timing, because the next month my book Aware came out, which summarizes all these things we're talking about. And that was talking about two realms of one reality. So the way we tell the story of our lives as humans influences how we live on this planet. So what I want to share with you here is the idea that if we can then have a common understanding that there are two realms, the macro state sometimes called classical Newtonian realm. Macro means large accumulations of energy called atoms. When you're larger than an atom, that's a macro state. And then there's a microstate realm called the quantum realm. So this is basically established. Quantum equations are even more accurate than Newtonian ones, only they apply most directly to microstates. And when you realize this reality, then you come to realize that it's kind of like swimming. You know, no one freaks out when you say, hey, go in a pool or a lake and let's go swimming. And the properties of buoyancy in the water are definitely different than the properties of buoyancy in the air realm. And that there are these two realms. And you can have a realm of swimming and you can have a realm of walking on the land. Since we don't freak out about that, what I want to suggest to you is that since we live in a body, the mind in modern times has gotten confused. It's gotten confused because it's equated the macro state with total reality. And it's a part of the reality, but it's not all the reality. So luckily, we're at a place now, and the Nobel Prize was given last year, showing all sorts of elements of quantum physics have been absolutely shown to be true, not just hypotheses. You know, we won't go into all those, but, you know, the massive connectivity, the lack of time, the fact that there are no entities in the quantum realm, there are just processes. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. So in this Newtonian macrostate classical realm, you know, there are noun like it is, like your body, my body, right? There is an arrow-bound unfolding of time. My mom is about to be 94. She's not going to make it all the way to 120. Time does exist in the macrostate realm. Let's be real about it, right? There is an appearance of temporal-spatial separation because it's true. My mom's body is over at her assisted living. This body is here. That's true. So when people say, oh, there is no separation, no, there is separation because there is a macrostate realm. If you're living in a body and hearing this, you've got a Newtonian aspect to your life. What happened, I think, is we've confused that realm with all of reality. And now we know very much what poets have known, what indigenous teachings have taught, what contemplative teachings have taught, is there's another realm, right? Sometimes people would equate this with the universal in contemplative teachings versus the relative in the classical. So when I presented this to my contemplative colleagues, they love this. When I present this to my religious colleagues, they love this. Because guess what? That plane of possibility, for those who are theologically oriented, it is the God. It's the generator of diversity. And so far, I haven't had one religious leader who's gotten mad when I presented a scientific view of religion as being a narrative that's emerging from trying to understand this quantum realm of the God. The generator of diversity is the formless source of all form. And there is no time. And that's where love comes from. And you feel the timelessness of it. So we need to be careful because, you know, we construct things with words, yes, but they are basically the surface level of ideas and beliefs and the categories beneath those concepts. So here's where this is more than just semantics. This is where if we can go out in the world, and even with a simple word like muy, or, you know, made up word like intra-connected, it's not a word. But if people can start living this way, it is possible to change how humanity approaches racism and social injustice, how it approaches misinformation and polarization, how it approaches climate disasters. You know, it's all, I want to suggest to you, coming from the linguistic symbol of me equals the individual. And we have time together to change that. Now, how do we do it? This is what I'll have as the last slide. It's about pervasive leadership. It's a term in academia we use that suggests that each individual can be empowered to embody, enact, and extend and embed, those are cognitive science terms, intention, attention, and information, the elements of the mind, by focusing energy in a direction of wise action without being fixated on a specific outcome. And you could say, well, what might we as a community embrace? It would be respect, relatedness, reciprocity, reflection, awareness of the reality of intra-connection, and that integration is the heart of healing and health. And we just remember all this with a simple word, mui, so that mui as an integration of identity is a way of recalling this notion of the science and practice of presence, that when you drop out of the macro state confined plateau into the micro state realm of connection, open awareness, and love that's in that hub, that's when you get this sense of mui. And you don't need to lose the aspect of me. You gain the we and amplify this in the love of mui. Mui is a way we can move forward with an interconnected devotion to promoting health on this planet. So I want to thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation right now. I'll stop sharing the slides and open this up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siegel. The chat is open for anybody who wants to pop their questions into the chat, and also the Q&A. Q&A is open. You can put your questions in there. So if there's anything you want clarification around, or if you want to put a hand up, you can put a hand up with the emojis, the reactions, however it works best for you. We're ready for it all. Giving everyone a moment to figure out their best way to access rim of awareness teachings.
Yeah, so the best way to access it, well, you can read the book Intra-Connected to get this larger, what do we do as a society? For you individually, it would be the books, Aware, and let's see, you could do the book Aware or Becoming Aware. Those are like companion pieces. So I can type that in if you want. Aware and Becoming Aware. Oh, there you go. You got it.
And Clarissa would like to ask you a question directly too.
Sure, absolutely. So those two books would be a way to learn the wheel of awareness practice, and Intra-Connected would be, the larger societal implications. Yeah. Yes, Clarissa, please. Do I need to ask to unmute? Do I do that?
No, I've done it, and she can unmute whenever she's.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for your research that has tackled something that is just so difficult to tackle. And I was just having a conversation yesterday with a friend about feeling very powerless in this world, and getting to a state where, I'm just taking care of my hoop, right, and doing no harm. And there's something inside of me that senses this is bringing forward a way to bridge from that sense of powerlessness to actually having hope about the future of this world. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little more about that.
Yeah, Clarissa, thank you. I totally agree. There's a tremendous amount of hope in this. About part of, just to make sure I say it, there's a beautiful book called Active Hope by Joanna Macy and a colleague. And Joanna is a close friend of mine. And I in many ways, writing this book, Intra-Connected, inspired by our relationship. But, I totally agree with you. I think there's a moment here, almost like recognizing there's a splinter in the soul of the modern psyche, and we're limping through life, almost about to destroy life on Earth. So if we identify the splinter and remove it, we can then walk in a more balanced way. So I know it sounds simple, but that doesn't make it easy. But I think it might just be true that the modern view of self as separate may actually be the splinter that we need to remove. And it's removable pretty quickly, actually. When you do studies on what's called self-construal, you can alter a person's experience of self as only separate really rapidly. I mean, you can do that with the wheel of awareness. You can do it with psychedelics. You can do it with the way you just phrase a research statement about, using the word we instead of you. It's remarkable. So what we need to do is have pervasive leadership and to try together to make this happen. That's why I'm so excited to be here with you. And this is, it's like the Margaret Mead statement. If you ever think a small group of people couldn't change anything, think again, because it's the only way things ever have changed. So when we embody that, literally live it through our body, we can do that. It's so interesting. I'm going to record a course, on the Mindsight Institute. We have courses. And this weekend, they asked me, what course do you want to record this weekend? I'm going to record an entire course. We already have a course on aware, but I'm going to do an entire course on this fundamental issue. Why is consciousness needed for change? And we're going to dive really deeply into how do you live from the plane of possibility? So that's that'll be just in a couple of days. We're going to record that. Yeah.
Dr. Siegel, there's a question
Yeah.
from Alicia Drivers in the chat box. As a spiritual director, I find this fascinating as a way to talk about spiritual freedom formation. In your profession, where in this process does the person interact with the divine? What plane or in what combination?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Thank you. I used to teach with John O'Donohue. He used to call me his twin, and as twins we would teach together. Yet he was an Irish Catholic former priest, mystic, Irish mystic, poet, a philosopher. But we would teach together, and this would always come up because I don't use the word divine, but he would, and we found complete consilience really in exactly what we're talking about today. So, I think when people start to tap into that plane of possibility and live from the plane, not isolating in a cave and just being in the hub of the wheel, that plane of possibility, there's a divine sacredness that emerges in the way they live. And John's body passed away over 15 years ago, but I think he would agree that this is what the divine is all about. Yeah.
Awesome. There's also a question here from Cheryl Stroller. Have you continued friendships with people who do not understand this? If so, how do you stay connected in full presence? How to stay in compassion?
Yeah, well, I would say most people don't understand this, because we're talking some pretty abstract things, quantum realm and, mathematics of probability. So, I've been, humbled by how challenging it is to try to articulate these things. And I think when you yourself in your body take the time, let's say, to do the wheel of awareness, which I hope you could do something like that, however you do it, when you start to really make the hub very accessible in your life, then when you see a person in front of you, you realize that they are kind of just a manifestation of the love that you are also a manifestation of. And whether they understand it or not, it doesn't really matter. Now what I'm always reminded of is the Pandopopulous forest in Utah, where there's like 48,000 seemingly separate quaking aspen trees. But when you go there, you find there's 6 inches beneath the surface is a common root ball. And when you test the DNA of those trunks, it's one tree. So, the trunks may not realize they're all deeply part of the same essence, but you can be a trunk that knows that and just sees the common essence, even if that other trunk doesn't. So maybe John O'Donohue would have said, yeah, it's like living with the light of love. And it's true. I mean, it's just when you start doing this practice, of accessing the plane, basically, you start seeing the beauty in everyone, and you just start falling in love with everyone. So whether someone understands or not doesn't really influence that.
Awesome. Sure. Cheryl is back on, and we can ask her to unmute and see if she'd like to ask her question. Right. Let's see. Let's add her to spotlight. Here she comes again. Now you can unmute.
Thank you so much. So that was my question, and it's kind of a follow-up. How do you, Dr. Siegel, help, let's say, a client who is so much in the oneness and not feel so depleted and discouraged and sad? And so it's a daughter who's feeling like, how can I stay friends with people who don't understand that what they do affects everybody?
Yeah. Well, certainly, I think we all have families where you see quite a range of, people like that. And I think it's really like what I was saying. And I can't help asking Cheryl, one of my favorite teachers of all time was Bob Stoller. I don't know if he was related to you, but I just need to ask. Anyway, but there's I think there's a way inside when we can only, have I think a devotion to a direction and not an obsession with an outcome. So that when you see someone, who wants to guzzle gas and, doesn't, throws trash out or whatever, I mean, you can make comments, but at some point, if they're not helpful, these are, you can just live by example, and it's like that flimsy fantasy of certainty thing. You cannot control everyone or everything. You can just set a direction, be passionate about the direction, absolutely find people who share your directionality, but not, don't let it bug you. That's what I would say. Otherwise the world would drive you nuts, and listen, we have to have our aim for the long run. When I work with activists, if you really are focused on just a particular outcome, you will burn out. So it's really about resilience training that comes from love. I mean, I don't want to overuse that word, but it really is that. And that's, I love the word resource, and the means again, again and again, and source is getting back to the source. So the plane of possibility is a resource that just changes how you live, and I've worked with a lot of people who get burnt out, and then we have them do the wheel, and then they find their resource, literally, and then it's a never-ending source of energy, because I think love is the life force of basically the universe. So this is why, in the name of this talk, the aware the science and practice of presence. It's about awareness, but it's about this larger thing that you're raising. So thank you. Yes.
Esther, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Hi, Esther.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you. Esther is a student of many of our courses. Great to see you.
For today, and I know it's late and this is a complicated question, but I just wanted to ask if you might, and it's fine to say it's too late to answer me, but when we're thinking about presence, excuse me, we're thinking about presence, and we're working with people who are in a time of actively or post-traumatic people, and they're struggling to be present and to stay in their window of tolerance. What are some ways and to present the wheel with an awareness of that struggle to help or to support them to come into doing the practice when they're very afraid, very understandably afraid of being overwhelmed?
Yeah, Esther, that's a great question. It's a really important question for us individually. It's an important question if you're a therapist, working with clients. When the client is actually the planet, it's an important question. I'm working with a program in Sweden called Inner Development Goals, IDG. You can look at them at, I think it's called innerdevelopmentgoals.org. I think is what it is. Anyway,
Innerdevelopmentgoals.org.
Innerdevelopmentgoals.org. But what I want to say is, we're working with the United Nations to try to see, as you know, the sustainability development goals have not been achieved year after year after year. Our human family is absolutely not following what all of the policymakers and the politicians and the scientists are saying. This is what needs to be done to create a healthier world. And actually, we have about 10 years to do it now. Less than 10 years, actually. So this group in Sweden got together to say exactly what you're saying. How do we actually approach people who may not want to be approached? And it's kind of what Cheryl's saying too. So you'll see what they did. They asked me to be a scientific advisor for them, and then I'll be teaching for them in the fall. So that question is absolutely the front and center, because even so you can invite people to do the wheel. You can invite people to think about we. I wrote the book Intraconnected for that purpose. But for many people stuck in the Newtonian classical macro state realm of separation, who have a short vision in terms of time and want to keep on selling stuff, producing stuff, getting money to buy more stuff, we're being stuffed out of existence, And so how do you actually work in a way that invites people to consider that materialistic, literally macro state view is about to end life on Earth as we know it, which it's going to do. And if this is true, then you can't just hit someone over the head with a hammer and say, stop thinking of yourself as a separate self. So what we're trying to do in the inner development goals is provide a bridge that invites people to say, no one's doing the SDGs, the sustainability development goals, in any timely way. So maybe there's something inside the human mind that is blocking our doing the sustainability development goals, the SDGs. So it's slow work, and you can see what that organization does. And I'm just an advisor for them. They're their own thing. But at the Garrison Institute, which I invite you to all check out, we're trying to cultivate the next generation of leaders in this. So go to the garrisoninstitute.org and go to the fellowship, and you'll see what we're trying to do to address just what you're saying, Esther. It's such an important question. How do we actually reach out into society in a way that invites people in, doesn't hit them over the head with a hammer, because that's not going to work. So I don't want to call it a strategy, but it's kind of an approach, I guess, is a more diplomatic way of saying it. It's an approach to say, we do have a kind of urgency to make an impact, but we can't act with urgency. This is the weird thing. You can't go to someone and say, oh my God, emergency, and then they just shut down. So it's
because it gets scary.
They're scary, right? So it's kind of this strange way where you can feel the urgency, and then you, as we say in the fellowship, when things get urgent, it's time to slow down. And the slowing down isn't becoming passive. Let's be really clear about that. It's just being very deliberate and doing it step by step, exactly right, and not activating the fight, flight, freeze, faint, threat states. But at the same time, it's really coming together. And if you do get a chance to read Intraconnected, we're going to actually do a public event at the Garrison Institute with the fellows there. I think a week, 2 weeks, I think it's April, the last Saturday of April, whatever that is. Please come to that, because you'll see some ideas about the the way of embracing this idea of intraconnectedness and that we're trying to do in a non-threatening way, but more an invitational way, because it's a win-win-win thing. When people really allow the sense of self to expand with gratitude, compassion, and awe, they actually get happier, they get healthier, right? And when people can be supported then in, having relationships that are for the greater good, all the research shows they're actually happier if they're being of service to others. And then the whole planet's going to benefit when, the whole biosystem realizes that one of its members, it has stopped thinking it's separate. And, in medicine, when a cell thinks it's separate and acts that way, we call it cancer. So the separate self-view, the solo self-view of a separate me, this macro state Newtonian mistaken identity, is a cancer of modern times. And it's time to, identify that, give the healing solution to it, which, yes, it's going to be a sacrifice of stuffing ourselves, but then it's liberating ourselves to really embrace the way of living together that's possible. So please come, to that event, and I think you'll find like-minded people in conversation.
I thank you very much. Can I ask you a quick personal question? Not personal, but I always smile when you talk about Joanna Macy.
Yeah.
Because Jack Macy, her son, used to live around the corner.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Whenever you mention her name, I smile.
Oh, that's
Thank you
sweet.
so
Yeah,
much.
Joanna is going to be 94 next month. And yeah, she's a month older than my mom. So yeah, she's a beautiful person and she's done beautiful things in the world. But there's a number of great books of Joanna's. Active Hope is one. The other is about her. It's called Wildly in Love with the World, I think is. I'm looking at my bookshelf for it. Something like Wildly in Love with the World. It's the legacy of Joanna Macy by a lot of her students, and she's written some, I don't see it here. She's written some essays in it too. Thank you, Esther. Great to see you. I'll see you in the next course. We've got all sorts of courses on aware and attachment we're doing now, and great to see you.
There's one more question. It's a small 1 minute. I think it would serve a lot of people. Which
Yes.
book of yours best synopsizes this presentation?
The end part would be intraconnected. That would be the best one, I think. The first part of the talk would be aware. The second part would be intraconnected. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for today's presentation. I know I'm going to have to watch it repeatedly to really unpack everything that you've had to say today. It has lots of personal meaning for me as well. So I want to just say thank you from myself, from everyone here today, from the Embody Lab. We so appreciate your time and the work that you're doing in the world. It's so very, very important and timely itself. And I know everyone is sending you lots of love and appreciation here in the chat, and we'll be reading your books, more of them. Anyway, thank you so much again, Dr.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We can do this. Let's do it.